let's start off with the highlight of the show, let's be honest, Baroness Fox and lockdowns, because we're going to get a great taste of Barlow being a knobhead, as you see every week if you've been following this show, and this is going to be just the same. We are going to be talking about Mark Drayford getting barred from 100 North Wales pubs over the looming alcohol ban. Now, I believe we have a clip of Baroness Fox in the House of Lords delivering a speech around both the situation in Wales and also on the recent bill that was put forward to people. If we can play that clip, that'd be great.
But is that true? Because surely in an emergency, more than ever, politicians could do with a hand. And I urge ministers to draw on the resources, the intellect, the intuition, the common sense and the intelligent criticisms of millions of people in order to move forward. But I want you for a minute to imagine what it feels like to be in Wales at the moment. They've endured a lockdown, and their reward from Welsh Labour is a 6 p.m. curfew, more Puritan prohibition than science, with utter indifference to the destruction of hospitality jobs. By the way, a shout out to the 100 North Wales publicans who banned the First Minister from pubs for 18 months. Hear to them. But it illustrates the infuriating way that citizens are treated, victims of arbitrary diktats from on high and never involved in any debate. You might disagree with me, my lord. You think I'm mad? That's good. Start to a civilised debate. Anyway, all this is unnecessary and not the way we should move forward. Because I think that the technocratic approach is bad for science and bad for democracy. Science is in danger of being turned into a set-in-stone tablet and a dogma. The very strength of the scientific method is about challenging and testing hypotheses and is being corrupted by an adherence to the science. And then those scientists who raise concerns about the official narrative have their professional reputations traduced as fake experts, shills, their interviews censored, dubbed in some misinformation, and heckled as mad. But surely, with a new virus, we need to hear all scientific views, not just those of SAGE, and all scientists, pro and anti-lockdown, should be prepared to have their work rigorously scrutinised and critiqued, and none should be silenced, or important questions won't even be asked, let alone answered.
So let me just read you through a little bit of the article before we bring in Baroness Fox to have a chinwag about this. So this is from the article from, I believe, Wales Online today, or the Daily Post, in fact. Mark Drayford barred from 100 North Wales pubs over looming alcohol ban. Wales First Minister has been banned from more than 100 pubs in North Wales following his announcement of strict new rules for the industry. The West Conway Pub Watch group said Mark Drayford would be banned from entering their members' premises for at least 18 months. It comes after Mr. Drayford unveiled new rules for the hospitality industry in a bid to stem the rising tide of coronavirus in Wales. They include a ban on alcohol sales in hospitality settings and a 6 p.m. curfew. The decision has sparked fury from business owners within the industry, and now the West Conway Pub Watch Group has taken matters further. He has now been banned from scores of premises, with Pub Watch organisers saying more than 300 hospitality businesses have said they would lend their support to the move. So, if we can bring in Claire here, and now it begins some of the awkward questions. I wanted to ask you this, and I think it's a fair question if awkwardly phrased. Why this attack on the Welsh Government? What is wrong with this policy? Isn't it just cheap reactionary populism to attack policies that aim to protect the public services and citizens' health? Isn't that what they're there to do?
Well, why the attack on the Welsh government is because I'm from Wales. Buckley is in Wales, and all my family, many and friends who live in Wales, many of them have gone along with a lot of the lockdown measures. They were shocked by the fire-break lockdown. It seemed to be particularly punitive, but they put up with it and they tolerated it, and they've come out of it only to be faced with what can only be described as policies which bear very little relationship to protecting the public. I mean, this is going to destroy jobs. That's the first thing. Secondly, it is Puritan. I mean, the no alcohol ban, there's no scientific evidence for any of this having any effect whatsoever. And I think the whole of lockdown, I mean, you say it's populist. I mean, does that mean it's popular? I mean, there is something to be said for noting that what is done on behalf of the people from on high by Mark Drakeford doesn't necessarily mean that we should all nod along to it, or that it's done actually in the best interest of people, because the Welsh economy is being decimated, and one should at least be able to ask whether the measures are proportionate or not. Nobody's talking about wandering around letting it rip, as the caricature is often said, or that it's mad. It's quite a straightforward attempt at saying there has to be ways that we have to learn to live with this virus that do not mean that ordinary people's lives are utterly destroyed for generations to come.
Well, the alcohol ban is in hospitality settings. It's not like you can't drink at home. And
very good of them. Very good of them. I mean, that's where conviviality happens.
A public health attempt. And the problem isn't the problem for Welsh Labour. And here's my concern that I'd like to follow up about why it's odd to pick on Welsh Labour and say, not for instance, the Conservative MP who's been banned from Warrington pubs, or indeed the fact that in Manchester, where I live, we're on tier 3 lockdown rules when places in the country that have far higher rates of infection are on tier 2 or tier 1, which seems to be a reaction by the central government against Manchester for standing up for its rights. It seems to me that you're not picking on the people who could economically help out the people of Wales, because what the Welsh Labour have is an unfunded mandate. They have to protect citizens' health, but they don't have the money to be able to protect the economy at the same time. I agree that there are problems with protecting the economy, but surely if their first instinct is to protect health, that should be lauded. And that's why
first of all, the whole speech was an attack on the government, right? Mm-hmm. You've taken the clip about North Wales. I know, because you asked me to choose a news story, and it had just happened, and I'm from Wales. I mean, God, come on, that's a setup. Otherwise, the whole speech was an attack on the government. I also drew attention to what had happened in Wales that day, because it had happened that day, and it seemed pertinent to illustrate the point. Because actually, one of the problems I've got with Labour is their only opposition is to say we should have harder lockdowns. And the only thing that they demand, and in this instance, by the way, the only thing they demand is often more funding, which is not the same as keeping a productive economy open. Because funding, it's not just about money, it's about quality of life, the kind of life you lead. And in this instance, in the case of the pubs in Wales, because they are being allowed to be open, but not serve alcohol, they can't even furlough their staff. Right. So actually, it's got nothing to do with Welsh funding. Similarly, Wales have, for example, brought in mandated mask wearing for all secondary school pupils in every part. That's got nothing to do with funding. That's just draconian and illiberal. Right. So the idea that I can't attack Labour if I'm going to prove that I'm not avoiding attacking the government, when the whole premise of my anti-lockdown point is to be anti-lockdown, not sectarian about any one particular party. That is the point of raising these issues, because lockdown is, in my view, a disproportionate, illiberal measure that is not related, is not going to be able to help us get out of this mess. And you say about protecting health. First of all, it's a decision that this is the best way to protect health. It is not the only way that you can protect health. And the health of the nation is not the only consideration. There are other values involved, but health, as it happens in Wales, is suffering very badly. If you're going to talk about Wales, 5 out of 7 of the health authorities in Wales are in special measures, and that's not to do with funding. It has nothing to do with funding in that instance. And I think it's appropriate. What I'm saying is it's got nothing to do with COVID. It's a badly run administration, right? So if they were so concerned about health, they might have sorted out the hospitals before we ever got to a COVID crisis. So I'm pointing out...
age of austerity, isn't that the...
No, it's not. No. It's the same age of austerity. Well, it's not an age of austerity. One of my objections is that the Welsh government in this instance, but the UK government overall, so they're all involved in this, are bringing about a policy-driven recession that is coming from the way they are dealing with COVID. That is the problem. If you shut down the productive economy, which is what they've done, you actually are ensuring that jobs will be lost forever. It's not a question of just having, as Manchester demanded, more furlough money. It's a question of the viability of anybody's capacity to run any kind of a company or a firm, and jobs will go for a long time to come. So you can get your furlough money, but there won't be any jobs at the end of it. And productive life and being at work is not just about money either, because actually it's to do with your sense of meaning for yourself. People are going to be demoralized. They are already utterly frustrated to have to sit there and listen to politicians dictate and micromanage every aspect of their life. Is making what is a serious pandemic that much worse for people, in my view.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is, isn't the problem not necessarily the lockdowns themselves? You've outlined some elements of it, obviously the destruction of economic capacity, the effects on our quality of life. But surely for, in highlighting the problems around lockdowns, we should highlight the problems around the government's shoddy handling of the crisis through their corrupt nepotism, because what we clearly probably needed was a decent track and trace system and local expertise that was employed to utilize that and other measures. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about that we should focus on instead of lockdowns? Or is it really that you just don't want lockdowns full stop?
Well, I don't think lockdown, the first lockdown I supported, I think we didn't know enough about the virus. I can understand a temporary suspension of civil liberties. I do care about freedom and civil liberties, and I do think that it's appropriate that we are ever vigilant when the state accrues to itself a huge amount of power. And for just to use one example, there was a mental health aspect of the coronavirus bill that actually meant that you could section people with on the whim of one doctor, entirely draconian policy, which, by the way, the government has just rolled back on. Guess where hasn't? Wales. I mean, why? I mean, that's one of the things that was most egregious and should have gone. But on your point about corruption and cronyism, of course, it's appropriate to point that out. I mean, there's so many things that one could point out by the way that the government have handled this that I think is inappropriate. And I think cronyism is one issue. But on some of it, I think you have to be careful about the moral high ground, because at the beginning of this, there were demands, if you remember, from every opposition politician that, PPE be made available now, straight away. Didn't matter where you got it from. All the kind of usual scrutiny. And, we can all look back and say, well, I don't know why you didn't just, go through the proper processes. Well, there was a panic. That's why. And actually, the government were under a huge amount of pressure to deliver now, yesterday, if not beforehand. And so I think they went to their mates. I don't think that's right, but I just think you've got to understand what happened. And you can
that's what happened, but it isn't. But it isn't right. Like, I mean,
no, it isn't.
Especially when they've got a history of failing to deliver.
It isn't, but I'm not. But I don't understand your inability to understand that each and every single political party is compromised by the way they've responded to COVID. And Tory bashing is the simplest thing to do at the moment.
I'm government bashing. I'm not, and I'm
government bashing. Fine.
I
was interested, and I therefore am interested in the fact that you object to me government bashing when it comes to Wales, because I'm Welsh and I'm therefore government bashing. But that apparently is not right.
I asked you the question, you answered it.
Fine. Okay, so I'm saying I don't want to bash anyone.
Question as an objection. Like,
I'm not. I don't know
the flaws across the country.
But exactly. So we should note those flaws across the country. But I'm saying that I think there's been serious problems. I actually didn't think that Andy Burnham was turned into some kind of a hero at one point, and I was shocked. It was great that he stood up to the government in terms of saying we shouldn't be in tier 3, but he was demanding, or a heavier tier, but he was demanding lockdowns. And I've said to you, I think that is actually the most draconian way of dealing with this. So it didn't feel to me as though he was actually having a proportionate reaction to what should happen. I also felt, I do feel as though the kind of regional competition between some of the mayors has been a bit unsavoury, to be honest. And I write for the Municipal Journal, local government magazine, and it seems to me that council leaders have sort of gone along with the government and simply just asked for more money, which, you talk about cronyism. I mean, if it can be bought that easily, I want there to be a political challenge to the government.
Advocating for the people they represent.
No, they're asking for money for their own authorities.
This isn't personal profit. Like Nicholas Soames, grandson of Churchill and brother of an MP, reported a 53% rise in half-year trading like a couple of months ago.
But I don't think it's right.
Been able to deliver on anything that they promised to do.
But I don't think it's right. I don't think it's right, though. I know that all those Serco things have gone up. Yeah, fine. But I don't think it's right. But if you run, no, that's fine. That's a good example. But if you run a local authority, if you're as powerful as somebody like Andy Burnham is, right, accruing money for your particular fiefdom is also partly, it doesn't matter whether it's personal or not. I'm making
boats, surely.
I'm making no. If you seriously think that giving money to councils finds its way into the pockets of the poorest people of the region, you're either naive or you're not following. I mean, that's not the way it happens. I'm just saying.
I'm not naive. I'm totally against the Manchester Council. But here's how bad Serco and the cronies that the Tories used. I would rather 100 times over local councils be given the cash and the responsibility to carry out the test and trace program, and local health authorities to do it.
I agree with that.
Than the corporations that fleeced us all.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I don't disagree with you on that at all.
I'm not happy about I don't laud anyone particularly, but it's an example of whereby we're in a situation where we're having to rely on someone that we don't even particularly like in our own city to stand up for us to deliver a better service because we can't trust central government.
That's fine, and that's on track and trace. But I don't necessarily know that track and trace is the only way out of this. And what I think has happened is that throughout, I mean, when we call on people for lockdowns, right, and when, for example, we say that this is the only way that furlough or more money in the local area is the only way that people will survive this. What I'm saying is that people's livelihoods and their capacity to be autonomous, free individuals has been completely compromised. And I'm disappointed not to have heard more of those political objections to what the Tories are doing from the opposition benches, because they seem to me, the policies of all of the parties are identical. They just vary in terms of how they would deliver them, but there's been no substantial challenge. It seems to me, I haven't heard any from, I find it galling that the only people who are opposing the government are Tory backbenchers, and they've called them out far more effectively. What were the Labour Party doing when they abstained in the House of Commons the other night, for goodness sake? I mean, do they not have a view? Is this playing politics? We're in a very serious situation.
You call me naive? Of course, they're playing politics.
Yes, and I'm saying that this is a dereliction of duty. I don't need to be told how bad the Tories are. I know that, but therefore you have to ask, what kind of opposition do they face? And I'm suggesting that if the opposition they face from the opposition benches, which what I'm more interested in, is coming from, from the left-ish, I wouldn't mind the alleged pro-working class party to show a bit of regard for the plight of the working class, because I think they've been absolutely shafted by the Labour Party, who seem to not understand that, first of all, the invisible frontline workers are about to carry on working throughout all this, that furlough doesn't pay them, that it's not just about money, that going for a drink in a pub somehow is deemed to be an unsafe activity. I mean, you were saying you can drink at home. Great, we're going to be confined to our houses. I mean, going to the pub can be part of civil society for a start off. It's where you meet your mates. It's where you actually have collective chats about things. They don't want that to happen. They're banning it from happening. And that's not, our best interests in terms of our mental health, never mind our health. It's got absolutely nothing to do with stopping you getting coronavirus unless they're going to lock us up forever.
Well, I have two further questions, and I appreciate the back and forth here. But one will get to some solutions in the end, so that's where we're going to end up on, and I'd really like to talk about those and get into those. But I do want to come back to something about the public health aspect of this, which is about COVID mortality rates, because it does affect the poor far more than it does rich elites, right? and and disproportionately communities of color, women, people who have asthma, pre-existing conditions, people with learning disabilities, and people with mental health issues as well. So really at-risk populations are suffering more high level of mortality from COVID directly, as well as indirectly by some of these measures of lockdown. Now, here's where I have a serious question for you, which is in opposing lockdowns and imposing on the grounds that seem very reasonable and pro individual freedom, which I have a lot of sympathy for. We have to then ask you, how many people is it okay to die of COVID in order for us to open the pubs? I mean, where are we at here? How do we make this choice?
Well, the very people that you're describing are the people who've had to carry on working throughout this anyway.
Yeah.
So they are the ones who are servicing the lockdowns. All these people who sit around going, well, what's wrong with working from home? I haven't got a bloody clue. I remember at the beginning when all these kind of lefty commentators were saying, well, I don't know who all these people are on the tube. What are they doing? We're all meant to be locked down. You think, they're going to work. Lots of jobs do not involve sitting in front of a computer. And when they say the wonders of working at home, they obviously don't live in a kind of flat that I'm talking about. So
they've been
exactly. That's what lockdowns are service.
You want to increase that threat.
I'm saying lockdowns are service. No, I'm saying lockdowns are being serviced by those people. So actually being anti-lockdown, right, is not about, you can be pro-lockdown and those people are still vulnerable. You can be anti-lockdown and those people are still vulnerable. Now we're going to have a conversation about whether it is the case that poorer people have a worse health outcome. Yes, guess what? No surprise there on anything and everything, right? That's why I don't like poverty. It's a bit of a no-brainer, which is one of the reasons why I'm particularly concerned about the impoverished way that people are going to have to live their lives as a consequence of lockdowns. Because you can say it's indirect and you can say, well, people are dying. I mean, you will know that we haven't taken any account of those vulnerable groups. I mean, if you have a generalized lockdown, you don't this is exactly what happened the first time. Those people who, for example, in institutional care, in care homes, the elderly and so on, especially elderly in their homes, the care workers who had to visit those elderly in their homes, they suddenly got forgotten because there was such a clamour for lockdown for everyone. So the very people that you would want us to pay attention to got lost in the morass, right? And we know that they were the vulnerable people. So I've got no objection whatsoever, and I've never argued that we should take no attention of those people who might be more susceptible to COVID. And I also think that if you're worried about the health outcomes for those people who are socially in weak positions, socially deprived, poor, and so on, what you should do is ensure that you don't impoverish them further by your policies, which is what is happening. They are losing their jobs, their livelihoods, 0 hours contractors. They're going mad. Even the pleasures of life are demonized as somehow libertine and illegitimate. And it's in that context that I think if you get a holistic picture, you'll realize that actually the impact of this, hardly anybody
are they saying that actually people who are already vulnerable and at risk, people who are essential workers, are going to be further threatened by the fact that the virus will spread due to opening public places for people to spread the virus further? Ultimately, it's not a puritanical attack on you can drink or be around people.
Yeah, I know, but first of all,
events I want all the places to be open.
The virus, as you'll know, disproportionately affects particularly over 50s, actually over 60s, over 70s, and so on. So the majority of the population are under 50, right? And particularly young working class people, if you're going to go down the class route, right? So why are they locked up? Why is everyone locked up? So what I'm talking about is having a more targeted approach. And on this one, Burnham was right. There's geographical targeting approach. There are protecting the vulnerable. You could discuss that. The point is that you're not allowed to discuss that, because then everybody just says, well, if we have any more liberalization, you're going to damage things. I'm saying that the damage that is being done to the health as well as the wealth of the poorest people in society is far outweighs the risk to them of this virus. I'm not trying to minimize that the virus is a risk, by the way. I'm not saying it is not a risk. I'm saying that for most people, catching the virus is not a lethal threat. But for those people that catch the virus where it can be a lethal threat, they need to be protected. Now, in the midst of all this, as you will know, there are many other health conditions that are sorely being neglected, and people are dying disproportionately. And particularly, again, this has a social impact in areas where the health service is not well resourced and not well run. So if you happen to have cancer, or you're not detected as having cancer, heart disease, those people who are in homes who have dementia, who are undoubtedly dying an earlier death, not of COVID, but of neglect, literal neglect. People going into hospitals. I don't know if you've dealt with that hospitals, but one of the things that you know when somebody you love or know goes into hospital is often you have to go in to ensure that they're getting their drinks regularly and so on. No one's allowed to go into a hospital anymore. So what you've got is, and that's because health workers are stretched, and often families provide a little extra barrier there to protect people's health. I'm saying if you only see contemporary society through the eyes of COVID, only through the eyes of COVID, right, you go down a kind of rabbit hole of that's the only thing you have to deal with. I'm suggesting that COVID is a very serious challenge to society, but our reaction to it in terms of political terms has meant that we have created far greater and deeper problems for the majority of ordinary people in this country.
Okay. Well, I mean, look, if we look at places that reacted to it well, pretty much everywhere in the world outside of the US has reacted to it better than us. Obviously, you're looking at New Zealand that sort of basically had a zero COVID policy, which was, extreme lockdown and then track and trace, and it was very effective. But you're looking, according to Global Citizen, at Senegal being second, like in terms of having mobile track and trace stations, mobile treatment centers, because they dealt with Ebola, maybe they were better prepared. But it seems to me that we've been extremely under-resourced and underprepared, but also that the reaction has shown incompetence, negligence, cronyism, and that at this point they're trying to keep the lid on a mortality rate that could explode due to activities that we all love and want to be able to participate in. And as I say, as someone who works in the events industry, or used to, and is now jobless and on the dole, right, I'd love to see my industry being cared for. We would have been fine if we were given the capital to keep going to 1 year, but we've not been given that. We've not had any economic protections that people who are employed are, and self-employed people have struggled really, really heavily. And that's when we've got a country with 5.1 million small to medium enterprises and so forth. So in this situation, I have sympathy for a lot of the points that you're making. But I do have a final question. I know we've gone on a little bit too long, but I'm going to bring in for one more one, which is, what are the precautions then that the government should be taking to protect public services and the health of the working class, essential workers who keep society going? What is it that it should be doing? You're saying nuanced in what way? Like if there's different levels of doing this, different ways of doing it, you're saying not regionally, or you're saying definitely local government should be allowed to tackle it the way they want, or, what are we saying here? Oh, Vicky, mute. Sorry.
First of all, I think that I do think that the vaccine is very good news. So that's one thing, and how that is delivered and who it's delivered to will be essential. Although I think that the mandating of vaccine use will backfire and lead to people reacting against it. So we have to be careful about that. I am still very anxious about particularly the vulnerable groups and the groups who are most at risk from it, often in hospitals, in fact, and in care homes and so on. I still don't think are being properly catered for. So I'm talking about a more targeted approach. And, you've said some of the points about mobile track and trace. My queries are, and I don't think they've been answered at all by the government, is, how effective are the testing? What do they say about false positives? How do we know that when people get the virus, how soon does that mean that they're immune? All of these questions would allow us to return to some form of normality sooner rather than later. But my broader point, I still maintain, is that the health of ordinary people is being detrimentally damaged for a long time to come by our reaction to it, because I think it is bad for our health to be confined to barracks, for us to be segregated from each other, for there to be no social activity. And I don't just mean opening up events industries, you know, like you, that's what the Academy of Ideas does. I'm not talking about it just from that point of view. I mean, in terms of our capacity to, we all know that we're stronger together. You know, we all know that basically isolating people, and I would have thought that you'd have been keen on, you know, our capacity to have some collective reaction. You know, the fact that demonstrations are banned during this period. It's not that I want to go on a demonstration of anti-lockdown, as it might well be made up of a load of cranks, but the danger to us, those of us who are likely to be dissidents in any kind of a future, is that what we've done is we've knocked the stuffing out of the working class. We basically told them that they've got to shut up and put up and sit on the couch and listen to what the politicians and their experts tell us. And I'm suggesting to you that
I think the broader point has been made.
But if that carries on, it will mean that the health of the very people that you care about will be damaged far more than by any virus. That is the point I'm making.
And the people I care about, I'm included in them. So the broader point stands, and it's a welcome addition to the debate. And I think relatively it has a lot of merits, though I still think ultimately we're in a situation where the incompetence leading to this point has put us in a situation where we are where we are. But we have every right to be frustrated. And in talking about frustrations in a really awkward and terribly put together segue, I'm going to move us on to another part. Thank you, Claire, for going back and forth on this.